Hello and welcome to week 2 of our Risks to Cultural Property Part 1 course. In week 2 we are going to work to identify and define risks. Again, we're within the Museum Study program and I'm still Rob and I'm still where I am. Now, at the end of last week, you would have looked at this video on risks as departures from a goal. This is such an important foundational idea, however, that I really wanted to go through it again. Besides, I think I have a snazzier collection than what you looked at before. I think before you looked at butterflies, and now I have this nice set of 25 objects. I've got 5 ceramics, 5 prints, 5 costumes, 5 natural history specimens, and 5 paintings. So a collection of 25 objects, and I want to preserve this. So what do I mean by that in terms of an operational goal, a SMART goal? I mean I want to carry that collection forward in time. And I'm going to make it specific 100 years. I want to carry it forward 100 years in time. And I don't want to start from today because, geez, I'm so busy today. I've got so many things to do. I don't have the time to give this very important project all the attention to planning that it deserves. So I'm going to start next year in 2017, but starting from 2017 I want to carry this collection forward in time by 100 years with minimum or ideally no damage or loss, and that is the goal. Now, of course, in reality things are going to happen. Here we see there are 2 items that just disappear out of the collection. We don't know whether they were stolen or misplaced or sent on loan and not returned and the record's lost or whatever, but they're gone now. So that's a departure from our goal. We were supposed to hang on to things. Maybe a big part of the collection got put on permanent exhibit and faded out over time. Well, that would be another departure from the goal. There's been some loss in value here. And finally, we see that there may be just a chance of an event that could destroy the whole collection. Maybe just a 1 in 10 or even 1 in 100 chance, but because the possibility is there, the potential is there, that's also defined as a risk to the collection. So our risks are departures from our operational goal of carrying our collection forward in time with minimal or ideally no damage or loss. Now, we want to identify and define the risks. Let's start with the idea of identifying risks. We consider risks to be the combination of an agent of change and a type of risk, leading to what we call a generic risk. Now, agents of change, sometimes called agents of deterioration, have been made popular by our Canadian Conservation Institute. There's actually a lot of different ways to slice and dice these, but this set of 10 agents seems quite useful. Physical forces, fire, water, criminals, pests, contaminants, light, ultraviolet, or other radiation, adverse temperature, adverse relative humidity levels or changes, and finally dissociation. Many of these agents of change can manifest themselves at different severities and frequencies. Let's think of this one risk, we'll call it R1, which is a high severity, low frequency kind of risk, maybe a very severe earthquake. At the other extreme, we might have a risk that's quite low severity, but really high frequency. Now, these could have equivalent impacts on a collection over time, but in this rendering or this way of looking at them, it always seems that risk 1 is much higher. That is the high severity, low frequency risk. Well, we could actually turn our whole chart on its side, or on its corner rather, and then we might get a better appreciation for how these risk magnitudes can actually be the same. In risk assessment, we often use something that's called this traffic light rendering, where red is a high risk, green is a low risk, and yellow is something in the middle. Here we can see that risk could be rare and catastrophic, like this seismic event in Haiti, that big earthquake that destroyed so much of their cultural property. Or at the other extreme, it could be continual and gradual or progressive, like the wearing of the spine of a book as it's handled. It's just gradually being damaged. In the middle are these sporadic events, like this fellow who's using his bum to knock a vase off a plinth. It's soon going to hit the floor and smash into pieces. It's a kind of sporadic incident. We can reduce risk by reducing the frequency at which it occurs, or we can reduce the severity at which it occurs, or we can do both. But these ideas of severity and frequency are key ideas in both understanding and assessing risks and in managing the risks. Now, just how we define these, we define a type 1 risk to be an event, a rare event, and specifically one that occurs less than 1 per 100 years, or say less than or equal to 1 per 100 years. That would be a type 1 risk. At the other extreme is a process that we define as occurring continually or at least once per year, as in seasonal environmental changes, say damp summers, dry winters, that sort of thing. And in the middle are these sporadic incidents, typically a few per decade or a few per century, but definitely more than once per 100 years, and not as rare as just once per year. So a few per year, or a few per decade. No, sorry, a few per decade or a few per century. Oh boy. Okay, to identify and define risks, again, just to remind us, we take an agent of change and a type of risk to give a generic risk. So we might have physical forces type 1. Could be a meteorite hitting your building, very rare. Airplane hitting your building, not quite so rare, but still not very common. Perhaps a major earthquake, a windstorm, a landslide, that sort of thing. Physical forces type 2 would be sporadic damage, like knocking something off a shelf, dropping something, mishandling, would be a physical force type 2. Physical force type 3 might include the poor support to a basket, leading it to distort over time, just continual rubbing of something like the spine of a book. Those would all be physical force type 3 risks. Okay, when we get to defining a risk, it's really helpful to think in terms of 3 parts. What's the source of the risk? Is it a geotechnical issue like a landslide or earthquake or that sort of thing? Or is it an impact from a truck running into the building or an airplane hitting the building, that sort of thing? What's the path from the source to getting to the collection? Say in the case of an earthquake, is it the direct action of the vibration on objects, or is it toppling of storage hardware, of shelves? Is that the path through which damage occurs? And then finally, the effect. Is it breakage? Is it like a rubbing type erosion, a wear of an object? That sort of thing. We try to be specific about each of these 3 aspects of the risk definition: the source, the path, and the effect. In some cases, it's difficult to be clear on one of these, whether that's the source, the path, or the effect. But as far as we can, we strive to be clear. we understand then that each generic risk, like a physical forces type 1 or an adverse temperature type 2 or continual warm would be an adverse temperature type 3, we could have under each of those generic risks a number of different specific risks, each defined by a source, a path, and effect. Now it happens for type 1 risks, identifying different sources is really most critical to defining a set of risks. For type 2 risks, it's often identifying different paths. So sporadic water leaks, how does the water get at the collection? Or criminal activities, how does the criminal get at the collection? These are type 2 risks, often best identified and defined by distinguishing different paths. Or finally, effects on the collection. What is the effect it's going to have? And most commonly, discerning different effects is the most common or the most useful for type 3 risks. But whenever we can, we like to think of all three, source, path, and effect, as we define a risk. Now, there's both an art and a science to risk identification and definition. And if I can give an example here, let's consider physical force type 2, where the most simple expression might be just defining it as a collection object breaks, right? That's a definition of a physical force type 2 risk. But it's too simple, it's too vague. It would be very hard to get our minds around, well, how would we quantify that? How many objects break? We'd have to think of the different ways in which we could lead to an object breaking. So this is really too vague, too simple. At the other extreme, we might define the risk, a specific risk, as a sophomore work-study student will try to remove the top drawer of a cabinet while standing on a wastebasket. One stiletto heel will puncture the wastebasket, resulting in a fall in which two objects are broken into multiple pieces and one object is broken in half. This will happen on a Friday afternoon. Now, of course, this is way too specific, way too complex a definition of a specific risk. Really, we're a bit like Goldilocks, looking for the bed that's not too soft or not too hard. And this is where there's something of an art to it. So we want not too simple an expression of a specific risk and not too complex, but something in the middle. Say, mishandling of a drawer results in the drawer dropping and objects contained break, crush, or dent. So here we have a source. A path is, a source is the mishandling, a path is a drawer dropping, and the effect is break, crush, or dent. So it's got all the elements of a risk definition, and yet this is a chunking of all the ways in which something could break into something that a collection manager with experience could think about. Has there ever been a drawer drop anywhere in the institution? How often does this happen? Is it something that might happen every year, every 10 years, every 30 years, that sort of thing? So that is a kind of useful definition. Just as a kind of humorous example of how we can be absurd in identifying risks, the spoof newspaper The Onion had an article called Project Awry, where they talked about scientists identifying every conceivable thing that can go wrong, or every possible risk. This is from their page 55,623, and some examples are run-in stalking, nuclear annihilation of planet, phone system down, balloon floats away, and so on. You can read through these. They're really quite funny, some of them. But it shows how absurd it can get if we get too detailed in our definitions. And yet, if we're really too vague, especially if we only think about agents of change and say, okay, well, physical forces as a risk, how significant is that? That's way too vague to get any kind of useful quantification. So we're seeking this happy balance. We're like Goldilocks, looking for the ideal risk definition. Now, your mission for this week is to complete watching this presentation, and you'll be happy to know you're within a minute or two of that. So you're almost done on that. Good job. You can tick that off. I'd ask you to read the paper, A Risk Model for Preventive Conservation, in which we describe how a hierarchical model can lead from the ultimate goal of benefiting society, the continuance and betterment of society as our ultimate goal in preserving collections, right down through the idea, our operational goal of preserving the collection, through to details like how much training do our volunteers get, what temperature is the thermostat in the collection room set at. All of this can be described within the context of a hierarchical goal, but it relies on having clear definitions. I'd ask you to browse through, and you don't need to read this all, there's quite a lot of material there, but to browse through the web pages of CCI's Agents of Deterioration. And there is the web references in this week's outline. And then I'll ask you to complete the section Identify and Define Risks. And here I'm going to ask you to identify and define risks within one of the type 1 generic risks. You choose the one that you think is going to be most relevant to your situation, or at least to start with, whether that's water in the form of kind of rare catastrophic floods, whether it's say physical forces, seismic issues, or that sort of thing. You decide where you want to work, but then work to identify and define a number of specific risks to comprehensively cover off that generic risk within your own situation. And be sure to post your work to the forum. This is really important that we share our work and comment on the work of others. Peer review is incredibly important for risk assessment and risk management. We really want that external perspective looking at the way that we're expressing ourselves to make sure that it's clear to other people, because we want it to be clear to ourselves a year from now or 5 or 10 years from now. And if it's not clear to other people, it won't be clear to ourselves when we look at it again a few years from now. So that's your mission. It's not impossible. It's a possible mission this week. So have at it. Enjoy. And remember, post your work, comment, send questions. Always happy to help. Ciao for now.